My dot planned to put me away, so I sold the home he counted on. What would you do if the child you raised, the one you sacrificed everything for, suddenly saw you as nothing more than a burden? What if you overheard their secret plan to put you away in a nursing home and sell the very house you built with your own hands? That was the moment my world shattered, and the moment I decided to take back control of my life. Stay with me, because what happened next changed everything. The phone was warm in my hand that evening, and for a moment it felt like a lifeline, like Rachel's voice could reach across the miles and keep me from sinking into the silence of this house. I had just finished a simple supper, meatloaf reheated from 2 nights before, when her call came through. I answered with the usual affection, the sort of tone a father keeps for his only child, and for the first few minutes everything sounded ordinary. She asked about my health, about whether I was eating enough, and I told her not to worry. I said I was fine, though I did not mention that sometimes I forgot little things, like leaving the burner on too long. Her voice was warm, but there was something hurried in it, something that made me imagine she was glancing at a clock or nodding to someone nearby. When she said she had dinner plans with Daniel and a few investors, I told her to enjoy herself, told her I loved her. She said she loved me too, and then I heard the faint click of her phone. I was ready to hang up when the muffled voices came through, as if the line had not fully disconnected. At first I thought I was mistaken, but then I heard Daniel's voice clearly, clipped and cold. He said it was time for me to go into a nursing home, that I was becoming a burden. My chest went hollow, my breath caught. And then Rachel, my Rachel, the child I had worked my hands raw to raise, spoke with a sharpness I had never heard before. She said the house would fetch close to $1 million, that the Denver market was hot, and with that money they could buy the place in Boulder they had been dreaming about. She laughed, actually laughed, and I swear the sound drove nails into my heart. She said I trusted her completely, that I was grateful just to hear from her, and that made it easier to plan around me. My fingers went numb and the phone slipped from my grasp, hitting the floor with a crack that echoed through the living room. I sat there, staring at the photo of Margaret on the mantel, her eyes fixed on me in a way that made me shiver. For a second I wondered if I had imagined it all, if maybe I was losing my grip on reality, but the words still rang in my ears. They were not spoken in anger, not blurted out in a moment of stress. They were calm, deliberate, calculated. They were planning my removal as if I were a piece of old furniture that no longer matched the decor. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked on, steady and unbothered, while my world collapsed. Outside, the spring evening hummed with the sound of crickets. Everything seemed to carry on as usual except for the storm that had broken loose in my chest. I looked around at the house, every corner filled with the labor of my life, and felt something inside me splinter. Rachel and Daniel thought I was too old to notice, too slow to resist. But I was still here, still capable of listening, still capable of deciding. I pressed my palms into my knees to keep them from trembling. A kind of cold clarity began to spread through me, sharper than any fear I had known since Margaret passed. If my daughter saw me as a burden, if the man she married saw me only as dollar signs, then they were not going to have the satisfaction of disposing of me on their terms. I thought of every board I had nailed, every wall I had painted, every dollar I had scraped together to build this home. They were ready to sweep it all away as if none of it mattered. But to me, it was everything. I leaned back in the recliner that still carried the imprint of Margaret's body from her evening reading. I could almost hear her voice, soft but firm, warning me not to give so much that Rachel forgot to be grateful. I had dismissed it then, thinking love would always be enough, but love had turned into entitlement and generosity into expectation. Sitting in that quiet room, with my late wife's photograph watching, I realized I had only two choices: to let them do with me as they pleased, or to take back what dignity and control I still had. My decision was forming before I could name it, an iron weight settling in my chest. I would not be discarded. I would not be their burden. Whatever years remained to me would be lived on my terms, and if Rachel and Daniel wanted a house, they would have to look elsewhere. This one was still mine. The chair across from me at the kitchen table has been empty for 2 years now, yet every night I still catch myself glancing at it as if Margaret might walk in carrying a dish towel, her hair tied back, her smile weary but welcoming. Tonight the chair seemed heavier than ever, the fabric worn down from decades of family dinners, laughter, and whispered conversations when Rachel was asleep upstairs. I sat there with a cold plate in front of me, unable to eat, my eyes fixed on that emptiness, feeling as though the absence itself had weight. The silence of the house presses in differently when you know someone has chosen to abandon you rather than being taken by death. Margaret's death had been cruel but inevitable. What I heard on that phone call from Rachel was something else entirely, a betrayal that felt like a wound I couldn't close. I remember Margaret's last weeks, her voice thin but still filled with that fierce edge of hers. She had told me again and again not to let anyone use me, not even Rachel. "You're too generous, Tom," she whispered one night, her hand trembling in mine. "Promise me you'll protect yourself." I promised, but I didn't understand then what she meant. I thought she was just afraid of leaving me alone, afraid I'd give away too much of myself because it was my nature. But tonight, with that empty chair staring back at me, I realized she had known something I refused to see. She had known the danger of a heart that gives without asking for gratitude. The walls around me feel alive with memories. The floral wallpaper Margaret picked out when Rachel was still a little girl, the faint scratches on the hardwood where Rachel dragged her toys, the window that Margaret loved to open in spring so the lilacs would perfume the whole kitchen. Every surface carries her touch. Every corner a reminder that this was not just a house but the vessel of a life built together. Now, sitting there alone, the chair across from me only made it clearer that everything we worked for was being reduced to a dollar figure in Rachel's voice. I closed my eyes and imagined Margaret sitting there again, her elbows on the table, the way she used to scold me for working too late. She had been the anchor of this family, the one who made sure that all the sacrifices meant something more than money, more than comfort. Without her, the anchor was gone, and Rachel seemed to drift into a life where ambition and appearances mattered more than loyalty. I wondered what Margaret would say if she knew the daughter she raised was laughing about selling the home we built nail by nail. I wondered if she would blame me for giving too much, for believing love could outweigh greed. The ache in my chest was more than loneliness. It was the weight of seeing my own child view me as an obstacle, a problem to be solved. I thought about the nights I came home covered in dust from the job site, Margaret waiting with coffee, Rachel asleep in her bed upstairs. I thought about how often I told myself it was all worth it, that the years of sweat and exhaustion were building a foundation not just of wood and stone but of gratitude and family. And now, here I was, staring at that chair, realizing that foundation had cracks I never saw. I reached for the photo of Margaret that I keep on the table beside me. Her smile was soft, almost teasing, the kind of look that made me feel like everything was going to be all right no matter how hard life got. I whispered to her like I have every night since she passed, but tonight the words were different. Tonight I told her I was sorry for not listening, sorry for letting my love for Rachel blind me. I told her I was tired of being the man everyone leaned on until he broke, and then I said something I had never said out loud before. I promised her I would not be their burden, that I would not let Rachel and Daniel decide the terms of my final years. The chair remained empty, of course, but for the first time in a long while it did not just symbolize loss. It symbolized choice. I could keep sitting here waiting for affection that would never come, or I could stand up, take the control Margaret begged me to take, and turn this betrayal into the beginning of something new. The ache was still there, sharp and unrelenting, but beneath it a harder strength was forming. I brushed my hand over the table's smooth surface, the same table where we once planned Rachel's future, and I whispered into the silence that I would no longer be defined by the emptiness across from me. I keep seeing Rachel's face in my mind, the way it used to light up when she was a little girl running into my arms after school. She had a smile that could melt any fatigue from my bones, a smile that made every hour of overtime feel worth it. I clung to that smile for decades, convinced it was proof that love was enough. But now when I replay the sound of her voice on that call, sharp and calculating, I realize that smile had become something else entirely, a mask, a performance. The warmth I thought was genuine had been rehearsed, a tool she used when she needed something from me. I never wanted to believe that about my daughter, but denial is a fragile wall, and that wall crumbled the moment I heard her laugh about my so-called decline. I can't stop thinking about how she had sounded when she spoke directly to me just minutes before the truth slipped out. Sweet, concerned, the kind of daughter anyone would be proud of. She asked about my meals, reminded me about the grocery app she had shown me. She even told me to take care of myself. For a brief moment I had felt seen, cared for. But as soon as she thought the line was dead, her tone sharpened like the edge of a blade. There was no concern, no tenderness, only calculation. It was like seeing her reflection in a mirror crack, and realizing the face I thought I knew had never really been hers. I sat in that silence for a long time, replaying the call in my head, trying to reconcile the daughter who hugged me after her wedding dance and whispered I was the best father in the world, with the woman who just plotted to sell my home out from under me. Which one was real? Maybe they both were, coexisting in her all along, and I had simply chosen to see only what I wanted. I remembered Margaret's warnings then, her insistence that love without boundaries can spoil into entitlement. Rachel's mask had slipped, and beneath it was someone I did not recognize. The memories come rushing in at odd hours now. Rachel as a teenager slamming the door when I told her she couldn't go out late, only to come back minutes later and apologize, wrapping her arms around me. Was that sincerity or performance? Rachel at 22 crying in my arms because her first apartment was too expensive and I had signed the checks to make sure she could keep it. Gratitude or manipulation? The line has blurred so much I cannot tell anymore. What I once considered proof of her love now feels like evidence in a case I should have opened years ago. I try to remember the last time she looked at me without that polished tone in her voice, the last time she seemed to see me as more than a stepping stone. Maybe it was when Margaret was still alive. Margaret had a way of keeping Rachel grounded, reminding her that family meant sacrifice and not just comfort. After Margaret passed, it was as if Rachel's mask grew thicker, her smile brighter, her words sweeter, but underneath, the calculations multiplied. I ignored it, telling myself grief changes people, that she just needed time. Now I see it clearly. The mask wasn't grief. The mask was survival, and she wore it because she believed I would always give in. The most painful part is not even the betrayal itself, but the realization that she knew how much I trusted her, how much I needed to believe her affection was real. She weaponized that trust. She used my longing for closeness as a cloak for her ambitions. And when she laughed with Daniel about how easy it would be, about how confused I would become, that was when I felt something harden inside me. Not just anger, but resolve. If Rachel's mask had slipped, then mine had too. I had spent too long playing the grateful, aging father, easy to dismiss, easy to manage. That role is finished. Tonight I sat in my recliner staring at the shadows on the wall and I whispered her name aloud, as if saying it might summon the child I once knew. But no one answered. Only the hollow echo of a father finally admitting to himself that the smile he worshipped was just a mask, and it had been slipping for years. Now it has fallen away entirely, and all that is left is a stranger who calls me Dad. The folder of old papers still sits in the bottom drawer of the kitchen cabinet, thick with receipts and records I never threw away. Tonight I pulled it out, spreading the yellowed slips across the table where Margaret once balanced the household budget with her careful handwriting. Each piece of paper carries its own echo, each number a reminder of the years when I thought sacrifice would be remembered with gratitude. My hands trembled as I sifted through them, not from age, but from the weight of knowing how easily those sacrifices have been forgotten. I found the tuition bills first, 4 years of the University of Colorado, nearly $48,000 in total. I remember the long nights, the smell of concrete dust clinging to my clothes, the ache in my back after double shifts. I would come home with plaster under my fingernails and collapse into the chair while Margaret massaged my shoulders. She would tell me I was killing myself, and I would answer that Rachel deserved better than we had. I see now how right she was, and how wrong I was to believe that giving more would secure Rachel's love. The wedding receipts were next, stacked in neat order. $32,000 for one day. I had told Rachel we could manage 5 at most, maybe 8 if we stretched, but she cried with that same tremor in her voice that used to undo me when she was a little girl. She wanted her dream wedding, the ballroom, the flowers, the string quartet. I worked weekends installing hardwood floors for a contractor who paid me under the table, my knees burning from hours crouched on unfinished surfaces. The night of her wedding, she leaned into me during the father-daughter dance and whispered that I was the best father in the world. I believed her then. I believed that promise would last. Further down were the bank statements from the year Daniel lost his job. They had come to live with me, just until they got back on their feet. I never asked for rent, never reminded them how the utilities doubled, how the grocery bills grew. Daniel would clap me on the back, calling me the most generous man he had ever met, and Rachel would hug me tightly, swearing they would pay me back. They stayed more than a year, both of them working again, both of them earning more than I ever had, but repayment was never mentioned. I paid for their anniversary dinner at a steakhouse that cost $200. I paid for Daniel's car repair when his transmission failed, $3,000 that emptied my emergency fund. Each time I told myself it was what family does. Each time I ignored the quiet voice of Margaret in my memory telling me not to give until it hurt. The echoes grow louder the more I look. The dollhouse I built for Rachel's 7th Christmas, with tiny curtains Margaret sewed by hand. The bay window Margaret loved, which took 6 months of overtime to afford. The desk I crafted for Rachel's homework, sanded smooth late at night while she slept upstairs. Every project, every bill, every exhausted evening had been another brick in the foundation of what I thought was loyalty. Now I see it was a foundation Rachel walked across without ever looking down. I lean back in the chair, my eyes blurring as the papers scatter before me. They are proof of a lifetime's worth of devotion, proof of the way Margaret and I carved our dreams into reality through sacrifice. But they are also proof of how easy it is for a child to forget when comfort becomes expected. Rachel's laughter on that phone call, the sound of her calculating the house's worth, rings louder than any thank you she ever gave me. The echoes of sacrifice do not fade. They reverberate through this empty house, through my chest, through every sleepless night. I gather the papers slowly, sliding them back into the folder, and I whisper to Margaret's photo that I finally understand what she meant. Sacrifice without gratitude becomes invisible. I gave until nothing was left to give, and now they see me not as a man who built their future, but as a burden standing in the way of their own. The echoes of all those years do not ask for repayment. They ask only to be remembered. And if Rachel cannot remember, then I will carry those echoes myself, sharper now, guiding me toward a decision I can no longer avoid. I noticed it first in the morning light, the way my hands trembled when I reached for the coffee pot. They have always been strong hands, hands that built this house board by board, hands that held Margaret through every storm, hands that lifted Rachel when she was too tired to walk. Now they quiver without warning, as though the weight of everything I have carried has finally begun to crack them open. I set the pot down too hard on the burner, and the smell of something scorched rose into the kitchen. For a moment I stood frozen, staring at the thin line of smoke curling upward, realizing I had nearly forgotten to turn off the flame again. That small slip, that ordinary human mistake, had been enough fuel for Rachel to laugh about my decline, to tell Daniel that I was no longer capable of living on my own. My own hands, once my pride, had become their evidence. I sat at the table and pressed my palms flat against the wood, willing them to steady. The grooves in the table reminded me of nights spent sanding planks in the garage, Margaret humming while she sewed curtains for the windows. Those hands had been certain then, sure of their purpose. Now, each tremor feels like proof of what they believe, that I am fragile, that I cannot be trusted, that I am nothing more than a liability waiting to happen. I hate the way the thought lingers, how easily doubt crawls into the cracks they have left in me. I stared at my knuckles, the skin rough and scarred from years of work. I remembered a winter years ago when I cut them open laying tile for Rachel's first apartment bathroom. She had stood in the doorway watching me, asking if it was too much trouble. I told her nothing was too much trouble for her, and I meant it. The blood dried on my hands, but the tiles shone white and perfect. She thanked me then, but that gratitude has been lost somewhere in the years since, replaced by calculation about the market value of what those same hands built. The hardest part is knowing that the tremor is real. Age has crept in while I was too busy working, too busy giving, too busy loving. There are cracks in these hands that cannot be sanded smooth or plastered over. But a crack is not the same as weakness. A crack can be the beginning of something stronger if it is filled with resolve. That is what Rachel cannot understand. She thinks a slip of the stove knob or a shake of the wrist is proof that I am ready to be locked away. What she does not know is that I have lived through decades of cracks, every setback in life filled with grit until it held strong again. As I looked at my hands that morning, I realized they were no longer the hands of a man willing to give everything without question. They were the hands of someone who had been used, pushed, and dismissed, and now they were curling into fists again. Not fists of violence, but of defiance, of decision. The same hands that built this home could tear down the future Rachel and Daniel were plotting. My fingers ached, my skin stretched thin, but when I closed them into my palms, the trembling eased. It was as if my body remembered what it meant to fight for something worth keeping. I held them up to the sunlight streaming through the window, the gold glinting off the scars. Margaret used to trace those lines with her fingertips, telling me they were the story of a man who worked with love. Tonight, I see them differently. They are the story of a man who gave and gave until others mistook his giving for weakness. These cracks are not the end of me. They are the beginning of what I will do next. Rachel and Daniel may see a burden, but I know better. These hands still belong to me, and before I am through, they will remind everyone of what they are capable of. The next morning I found myself staring at the business card I had kept tucked in the back of my desk drawer for years, the edges worn from being handled but never used. Harold Lawson, attorney at law. Margaret had insisted I meet him back when her illness grew worse, just to be sure our affairs were in order. At the time I thought it was unnecessary, but she was always the one who saw further than I did. Now her foresight felt like the only rope left for me to hold. I slipped the card into my wallet, put on the gray suit I had worn to her funeral, and drove into town with the kind of nervous energy that comes before a storm. The law office was in a modest brick building on Main Street, not flashy, the kind of place that took care of ordinary people rather than corporations. I sat in the parking lot for a few minutes, gripping the steering wheel, feeling the pulse in my hands. It had been years since I had asked anyone for help. My pride told me to drive away, to solve this on my own, but pride had gotten me here in the first place, blinded by the hope that Rachel would always stay grateful. Margaret's voice echoed in my head, soft but stern, urging me to go inside. So I did. The receptionist greeted me kindly, her voice gentle in a way that reminded me of Sunday school teachers from my childhood. I told her I had an appointment, and she led me to Harold's office. He rose from behind his desk when I entered, his hair grayer than I remembered, but his handshake firm. He remembered Margaret, too, asked after Rachel in that polite way people do when they expect a proud answer. I managed a smile that didn't reach my eyes. We sat down, and I told him everything. The phone call, the laughter, the talk of selling my house before I was even gone. The words burned as they came out, my voice catching at times, but Harold just listened, his pen moving across a yellow legal pad. He didn't interrupt, didn't judge, only nodded occasionally, like a man who had heard this story more often than he cared to admit. When I finished, he leaned back, folding his hands, and let out a quiet sigh. "Tom," he said, "you need to understand something. Your daughter and her husband have no legal right to your property. The deed is in your name alone. They can't force you into a nursing facility. They can't sell the house without your consent. They might try to pressure you, but that's all it is, pressure." The relief that washed through me was sharp, almost painful. For days I had been carrying the fear that they could strip me of everything with a few signatures. To hear otherwise felt like air in a drowning man's lungs. But alongside the relief was something harder, something that glinted like steel. If the house was mine entirely, then the next move would be mine as well. Harold studied me for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I've seen families tear themselves apart over less. I know this must hurt more than I can say, but you still have choices. Whatever you do, make sure it's on your terms, not theirs." I nodded, staring at the papers scattered on his desk. My terms. I had forgotten what that felt like. For years I had lived on Rachel's terms, on Daniel's needs, on everyone's expectations but my own. Now the idea of reclaiming that power filled me with a strange calm. We spoke for nearly an hour about practicalities. He explained how quickly a property could sell in the current market, how cash buyers were waiting with open checkbooks. He told me that if I wanted, the house could be listed and under contract before Rachel and Daniel even returned from their trip. Each word sank deeper into me, turning fear into resolve. I asked questions, checked every detail, the same way I once checked blueprints on a job site. I wasn't confused. I wasn't helpless. I was in control. When it was time to leave, Harold stood and shook my hand again. "Whatever you decide, Tom, remember this. It's your house, your life. Don't let anyone take that away from you." I stepped out into the sunlight, the card heavy in my pocket, the weight of choice heavier still. For the first time since Margaret died, I felt something close to steady. My hands were still cracked, still trembling, but they curled into fists again, fists that would not be pried open by anyone who called me a burden. I walked through the house that afternoon as if I were both owner and stranger, my steps slow, my eyes catching on every detail I had once passed without notice. The walls seemed to breathe with the life Margaret and I had poured into them, each corner whispering a memory I could not escape. I started in the living room, where the afternoon light filtered through the bay window Margaret had begged me to build. I had told her we couldn't afford it at the time, but she smiled in that way she always did, half challenge and half faith, and I gave in. I worked nights until my hands ached, measuring and cutting until the angles fit just right. When it was finished, she would sit there with her book and a cup of tea, the sun painting her hair gold. I can still see her there, though the chair sits empty now. I let my hand brush over the fireplace mantel where Rachel's stocking once hung each Christmas. I remembered her face at 7 years old, wide-eyed as she tore through wrapping paper to find the dollhouse I had built in the garage. Margaret had sewn tiny curtains, and I had copied the very window she used to read beneath. Rachel squealed that it looked just like our home, and I thought in that moment she understood how much love went into every nail, every brush of paint. That memory clings to me, though now it feels more like a question than an answer. Upstairs, the hallway creaked the same way it always had, and I paused outside Rachel's old room. The walls are still a pale yellow, the color she begged for on her 16th birthday. Posters of forgotten bands still curl at the edges, photographs of friends who have long drifted away still taped to the mirror. I remembered rocking her to sleep in that very room, my body swaying back and forth in rhythm with her cries until her tiny fists loosened and her breath grew steady. Later, I would sit at her desk, helping her with algebra she swore she would never understand, only to watch her ace the test the next week. I lingered there a long time, wondering when those nights of trust and closeness had turned into something so transactional. In our bedroom, I felt my chest tighten. Margaret's side of the bed remains untouched, her glasses still folded on the nightstand, her bookmark resting on page 247 of the novel she never finished. I opened the closet, and her clothes still carried her faint perfume, a scent that could bring me to my knees even now. It was in that room she had taken my hand during her final days, and whispered for me to protect myself. I had promised her, but as I stood surrounded by her things, I felt the weight of my failure pressing against me. I had not protected myself. I had let Rachel and Daniel live in my generosity as if it were their birthright, until they forgot that love should come with respect. I moved into my office, where framed photos of job sites and construction crews lined the shelves. There was a picture of Margaret in a hard hat, laughing as she handed out lemonade to my workers one summer when she was pregnant with Rachel. I remembered every loan we took, every meal of beans and rice, every second job that kept us going when we couldn't afford contractors. We built this place with sweat and sacrifice, not just as a shelter, but as a testament to who we were. The thought of Rachel selling it for profit stung worse than any physical wound I've ever carried. Room by room I walked, and each step pulled me deeper into the truth. This house is not just wood and stone. It is 25 years of my life, of Margaret's love, of Rachel's childhood. To walk away from it would mean leaving pieces of myself behind, but to stay would mean letting them strip me of it all as if it were theirs to take. By the time I returned to the living room, standing once more before that bay window, I felt the decision settle in my bones. If this house carried so many memories, then it deserved to be remembered as ours, not as their stepping stone. Whatever came next, I would not let their greed erase what Margaret and I built. This home had always been a monument to sacrifice and love, and if I had to let it go, I would do it on my own terms, not theirs. The decision weighed on me for days, yet once it was made, my steps felt strangely lighter. I searched through names and numbers until I found one that caught my eye. A man called Michael Barnes, a realtor known in town for quick sales and cash offers. His photograph on the website showed a confident smile, the kind of smile that told me he closed deals fast and didn't waste time with unnecessary chatter. I dialed his number with a steady hand, and when his voice came on the line, calm and professional, I introduced myself and told him I was interested in selling my house. He asked when I would like to meet, and without hesitation I said, as soon as possible. That afternoon he arrived in a sharp suit with a leather portfolio tucked under his arm. When I opened the door, he paused in the entryway, his eyes moving across the crown molding, the polished oak floors, the open archways. He nodded with genuine appreciation, not the empty compliments people give to be polite. I felt a flicker of pride rise in my chest, the old craftsman in me recognizing another man who knew quality when he saw it. I told him I had built much of it myself, and he raised his eyebrows, impressed. "You did all this by hand? No wonder it feels different in here." His words warmed me, even as I reminded myself why he was standing in my living room. We walked from room to room, his tablet clicking as he took notes and photographs. I watched him run his hand along the granite countertop Margaret had chosen, his eyes lingering on the bay window that had cost me months of overtime. He pointed out the built-in shelves by the fireplace, the seamless flow between rooms, and with each remark I felt the house come alive again, not as a relic of my memories, but as a piece of work worthy of respect. For the first time since Rachel's betrayal, I felt something close to dignity return. When we sat down at the kitchen table, he showed me comparable properties in the neighborhood. "Homes like this are rare," he said, tapping the screen. "Well-maintained, original owner, custom features. I'd suggest listing it at $890,000. We'll move it quickly at that price, probably with multiple offers." The number hit me like a wave, more than Rachel had guessed on that phone call, more than I had dared imagine. I leaned back in my chair, my eyes drifting to the window where Margaret once stood watering her plants, and I thought how she would smile to see our work valued so high. I asked him how quickly it could happen. He didn't blink. "If you want speed, I can line up investors who pay cash. No mortgage delays, no endless inspections. You could be under contract within days, closed in less than 2 weeks." My pulse quickened. Rachel and Daniel were due back from their trip in a little over a week. If I moved fast enough, by the time they set foot back in Denver, the deed would no longer be mine. It would be finished, irreversible. I told him I wanted to proceed. His smile widened just slightly, the mask of professionalism slipping to reveal his own excitement. "Then let's make it official," he said, pulling out the preliminary paperwork. I read every line carefully, the way I used to study blueprints, my engineer's eye catching each clause. There was no confusion in me now, no helplessness. I initialed where required, signed my name where needed, and when I pushed the papers back across the table, I felt as though I had just laid the final stone in a wall Rachel and Daniel would never climb over. As he gathered his things to leave, Michael shook my hand firmly. "You've made a smart move, Mr. Miller. Sometimes a clean start is the best start." His words lingered after the door closed behind him. A clean start, that was what I was buying with every signature, every decision, every ounce of resolve that now ran through me. That evening the house felt different. The walls still carried the echoes of our life, Margaret's laughter, Rachel's childhood footsteps, but beneath it all there was something new, a quiet thrum of power returning to me. The secret sale was in motion, and for the first time in a long while, I was not the man waiting to be managed or discarded. I was the man making the choices. And I knew when Rachel and Daniel returned, their masks of control would shatter the way mine once had. I drove across town the following morning with a single suitcase in the back seat, the sun just beginning to burn off the haze that hung over Denver. The realtor had promised the sale would move quickly, and I knew I needed somewhere to land when the papers were final. The sign outside the complex read Sunset Ridge Senior Apartments, though I could see nothing of ridges or sunsets, only a row of beige buildings with neat shrubs trimmed too perfectly to feel real. The parking lot was almost silent, a few cars parked crooked, as if their owners had long since stopped caring. I sat there with the engine idling, staring at the building that would become my refuge, or perhaps my exile. Inside the office I met the manager, a woman with a tidy smile who spoke in the efficient tone of someone who had repeated the same sentences 1,000 times. She showed me a furnished one-bedroom, and as soon as the door opened, the scent of industrial carpet cleaner filled my nose. The furniture was plain, generic, a couch that looked comfortable enough for a nap, but not for a memory. I walked slowly through the space, my footsteps hollow on the laminate floor. The kitchen had white cabinets, no scratches, no dents, nothing to tell a story. It felt more like a motel than a home, but perhaps that was fitting. A place not to live in, but to wait in. Still, I signed the papers. I put down a deposit in cash, grateful for the clean transaction, no questions asked. As I carried my suitcase inside later that evening, I felt the sharp difference in weight between what I had brought and what I had left behind. In that suitcase were Margaret's jewelry box, the photo album of Rachel's childhood, our wedding picture, and the novel Margaret never finished. Everything else remained at the house, waiting for strangers who would never know the meaning of each item. The decision cut at me, but it was the only way to move forward. I placed the jewelry box on the dresser, careful as if Margaret might still scold me for handling it roughly. I set the wedding photo on the nightstand, the frame catching the light of a lamp that hummed faintly when switched on. For a long moment I sat on the edge of the bed staring at that photograph, at the two faces smiling on a June day decades ago, unaware of how quickly time would steal one of them away. I whispered to her that I was here, that I had found a place safe from betrayal, but my voice cracked and the silence that followed felt heavier than before. The first night I hardly slept. The air conditioner rattled in the corner, and every sound from the hall startled me awake. I was used to the groans of old wood, the creak of the stairs, the wind through the bay window. Here, the silence was sterile, indifferent. I woke before dawn and sat by the small window that looked out onto the parking lot, watching a neighbor in slippers shuffle out to collect a newspaper. No one waved, no one looked up. It struck me then that this was not a neighborhood, not a community, but a holding ground, a place where the old drifted when they no longer fit anywhere else. And yet, I felt something else beneath the loneliness. Safety. Rachel and Daniel would not think to look for me here. They would drive past these plain beige walls without a second glance. In this anonymity, I had found a kind of shield. I was not their burden anymore. I was simply another man in another apartment, free in a way I had not felt in years. As I lay back on the bed, the mattress stiff and unwelcoming, I let my hand rest on the jewelry box, on the cool metal clasp Margaret's fingers once touched. This was exile, yes, but it was also the first step of a life lived on my own terms. I had left behind the home that held my past, but I had carried with me the pieces that mattered most. Everything else was just walls and furniture, and those could be replaced. What could not be replaced was the decision I had finally made, to live as my own man again, even if it meant doing so in a room that smelled of bleach and emptiness. The morning after I moved into the apartment, I dressed in my best navy suit, the one Margaret had bought for Rachel's graduation, and drove downtown with the contract papers folded neatly inside my briefcase. The weight of them felt heavier than steel. For years my money had moved through familiar channels, the same local bank where the tellers knew me by name, and Rachel sometimes accompanied me as a girl, holding my hand while I filled out deposit slips. But now that bank felt like a doorway Rachel could easily walk through, and I needed walls she could not scale. I searched until I found a smaller institution with a reputation for privacy, a place called Riverbend Community Bank. It was tucked in a modest stone building on the corner of Franklin and Elm, the kind of place most people drove past without noticing. That was exactly what I wanted. Inside, the lobby was quiet, the air cool and faintly smelling of polished wood. A young woman at the front desk asked my name and purpose, and when I told her I was here to open a new account for a substantial deposit, her smile stiffened slightly before she offered me a seat. I waited only a few minutes before a man in his mid-40s stepped out, hand extended. His name was David Morrison, a private banker with kind eyes and a calm manner that reminded me of the doctors who once explained Margaret's treatments with quiet patience. We sat in his office, the blinds drawn just enough to soften the light. I told him about selling my house, keeping the details simple, leaving out the part about betrayal and revenge. He asked careful questions, not prying too deeply, and I appreciated that. When I told him the deposit would be close to $890,000, I watched his expression shift, professional composure wrapping more tightly around his features. He nodded once and said they would be honored to assist me, and within minutes he began preparing the paperwork. The forms were thick, pages of disclosures and options, but my hands were steady as I signed them. He explained their premium account services, higher levels of security, protections for large balances. I listened carefully, weighing each choice the way I once weighed materials on a construction site. By the time the stack was complete, I had more than just a new account. I had a new identity. Not the man Rachel thought she could manipulate, not the confused old father waiting for permission to live or die, but a man with resources protected by walls she would never breach. As David tapped on his keyboard to initiate the transfer from my old bank, I found myself glancing at the pen in my hand. It had been years since I felt so deliberate, every signature an act of independence. When he slid the confirmation page across the desk, I stared at the numbers printed in bold, more money than I had ever seen gathered in one place. It was not just currency. It was proof of my life's work, proof of every hour Margaret and I sacrificed, and now it was safely mine again. He closed the folder and leaned back. You'll receive your debit card and checks in the mail within a week, but the account is active as of now. The funds should clear by Wednesday. I thanked him, my voice steady but quiet, and when I shook his hand I felt a strange lightness in my chest. I had secured not only my money but also a piece of myself. Walking back to my car, I looked up at the sky. The day was bright, almost too bright, the kind of morning Margaret used to call a clean slate. For the first time in years, I felt something close to that. Rachel and Daniel thought they could strip me down to nothing, but now I had built a wall higher than any they could climb. This bank, this account, this new beginning, it was more than financial. It was a declaration. When I slid into the driver's seat, I pulled the photograph of Margaret from my wallet and set it on the dashboard. "We're safe now," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. The streets stretched out before me like an open road, and though I was alone, I no longer felt powerless. I had stepped out of the shadow they cast over me. I was not their burden, not their possession. I was Thomas Miller, and I was starting over on my own terms. I returned to the house several times during that week, moving quietly as if each step were a secret. The new locks clicked beneath my key, a sound that reassured me even as it unsettled me. It felt strange to walk through those rooms knowing they were no longer truly mine, that soon strangers would fill them with their own laughter and their own sorrows. Yet I needed to be there to collect the last of what I could carry, to make sure the paperwork in the study was organized, to prepare for the closing that would finally sever the tie. The neighborhood was alive in its usual way, but every glance carried weight now. Mrs. Whitfield across the street stood watering her azaleas the morning I hauled a box of photo albums to the car. She raised a hand to wave, and I waved back, my smile too stiff, my chest too tight. She tilted her head, her eyes narrowing with curiosity, and I knew she was wondering why I was coming and going so often, why men in business suits had been seen leaving my front porch with folders in their hands. She had always been kind, the type who baked cookies for neighborhood gatherings, and it pained me to offer her nothing but half-truths. "Just some work being done," I said when she called across the yard, her voice sharp with neighborly concern. She nodded, though the look she gave me said she did not quite believe. Later that afternoon, I saw a car I did not recognize drive slowly down the street, pausing just a moment too long in front of my house. The windows were tinted, the figures inside indistinct. Perhaps they were nothing more than curious buyers checking the neighborhood, or perhaps Rachel had asked a friend to swing by. I stood at the curtain until they drove on, my heart thudding as if I had just been caught trespassing in my own life. The paranoia was new to me, and I hated it, but it came with the territory of secrecy. Once you decide to hide something, even the ordinary feels like a threat. Inside, the house seemed to sense my unease. Every creak of the floorboards echoed louder, every shadow seemed longer. I walked from room to room, telling myself I was only checking doors and windows, but what I was really doing was saying goodbye in fragments. In the kitchen, I touched the counter where Margaret rolled out pie dough each Thanksgiving. In the living room, I straightened a cushion on the couch Rachel once sprawled across to watch Saturday morning cartoons. Upstairs, I paused at the door to her room, listening for a sound that would never come again. It was as though the house itself wanted to hold me back, to whisper that once I walked out for the last time, it would no longer belong to me. As the sun set, shadows stretched across the yard. I watched Mrs. Whitfield carry a watering can back inside, glancing once more in my direction. I imagined the whispers that might already be circling the block. Neighbors wondering why I seemed restless, why I no longer stopped for small talk, why my lights burned late into the night. In their eyes, I was likely just another old man slipping into confusion, one more story for the street to trade over fences. I almost laughed at the irony. They thought me vulnerable when in truth I was orchestrating a plan more deliberate than anything I had done in years. Driving back to the apartment that night, I saw those shadows follow me in my rearview mirror. They were not literal, of course, but they clung to me, the suspicion of neighbors, the secrecy of transactions, the possibility of Rachel returning sooner than expected. Every headlight that appeared behind me made me tighten my grip on the wheel. I knew I was playing with time, each day a delicate balance between preparation and exposure. But beneath the tension was a current of defiance. Let them wonder. Let the neighborhood whisper. I had lived here long enough to know every crack in the pavement, every face behind every door. This was still my story, not theirs. And when Rachel came back, the shadows would not be enough to protect her from the truth I had written into the very walls of this house. I sat at the small desk in my apartment, with a pen in my hand and a blank sheet of paper staring back at me. For all the contracts I had signed, all the official documents that marked the progress of the sale, this was the hardest page I had faced. A letter to my own daughter. Words that would not only reveal the truth of what I had done, but also carry the weight of every disappointment and every betrayal. I picked up the pen, wrote a line, then scratched it out. Too bitter. I tried again, softer this time, but it sounded weak, like I was begging for her understanding. I set the pen down and pressed my palms against my forehead, listening to the hum of the refrigerator in the silence. I thought of Margaret then, the way she used to write notes for Rachel's lunchbox when she was a child. Little messages folded neatly beside an apple or a sandwich. You are loved. Do your best today. Dad and I are proud of you. Rachel used to wave those notes in the air when she came home from school, laughing, glowing. Somewhere along the way, those words had stopped mattering to her. Now, I was the one writing, but my message would be the opposite of those tender lines. This letter would not reassure. It would reveal. I began again, the ink flowing steady this time. Dear Rachel and Daniel, I wrote, and I paused, staring at their names side by side. It felt wrong to join them, but they had joined themselves in this betrayal, and so they would read my words together. I told them I had heard their conversation. I told them I knew about the plan to put me in a nursing home and sell the house. I told them the house had already been sold for $890,000, and the money was now in an account they would never touch. I described how their belongings had been packed and moved to storage, how they had 30 days to claim them before fees began. I wrote of my sacrifices, of the years of labor, of the dreams Margaret and I built into every wall. I wrote of how their laughter that night cut deeper than any wound I had ever suffered. I stopped often, staring at the words, trying to decide if I had gone too far or not far enough. At first the sentences came hot with anger, sharp and unyielding. But as the page filled, I felt something else steadying my hand. It wasn't rage anymore, but clarity. I didn't want the letter to be cruel for cruelty's sake. I wanted it to be undeniable, a mirror they could not look away from. So I softened the edges, not to comfort them, but to ensure they understood. I ended with 4 words that nearly broke me as I wrote them. Love, Dad. Always Dad. When I laid the pen down, my hand ached from the grip. I read the letter once more, and in it I saw not just my pain, but Margaret's voice, her warning, her insistence that I protect myself. I folded the paper carefully, slid it into an envelope, and wrote their names on the front in the careful script Margaret once admired in me. The envelope looked so ordinary sitting there on the desk, yet it held the full weight of everything I had become in these weeks. I sat back and closed my eyes. I imagined Rachel's face when she opened it, the disbelief, the shock, the dawning realization that I had not been as helpless as she thought. I imagined Daniel's anger, his curse under his breath when he realized his plans had crumbled. But more than that, I imagined Margaret watching from wherever she was, her eyes steady, her lips pressed with that half-smile she wore when I finally listened to her advice. The night grew darker outside, the hum of traffic drifting through the thin apartment walls. I placed the envelope in my briefcase, ready to pin it to the inside of the front door when the time came. It felt like placing a stone on a grave, final and unmovable. Yet in the act there was release. I had written what needed to be said. I had taken back my voice. And when Rachel and Daniel returned, those words would be the first thing to greet them. Not my weakness, not my silence, but the truth written in my own hand. The package arrived at my apartment just after noon, a plain brown box left at my door. I carried it inside with a steady hand, though my heart beat faster than it should have. Inside was the camera, small and unremarkable, disguised as a simple phone charger. I turned it over in my hand, marveling at how ordinary it looked, how easily it could disappear into the background of a room. It felt almost ironic that after decades of building with wood and steel, my final act of defiance would rest in something that weighed less than a hammer. I read the instructions carefully, testing the device in my kitchen first. A blue light blinked once, then faded, and on my phone screen the image of my own face appeared, sharp and clear. I waved my hand, watching the motion trigger the recording. The sound came through as well, even the faint hum of the refrigerator and the scrape of a chair across the floor. It worked better than I expected, and for the first time in weeks I felt a quiet thrill, the satisfaction of precision. That evening I drove back to the house with the box on the passenger seat, the letter tucked securely in my jacket. The streets were familiar, but every turn felt charged, as if I were returning to a battlefield. I parked in the driveway and unlocked the door with my new key, stepping into the silence of rooms that no longer belonged to me. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and old wood, the same as it always had, but now each breath carried the knowledge that soon this house would be nothing but someone else's address. I chose the outlet by the front door, low enough to be unobtrusive, high enough to capture the entryway. My fingers were careful as I plugged the camera in, angling it just right. On my phone I checked the view, the frame of the door, the hall table, the spot where I would tape the envelope. Perfect. I walked in and out of the frame several times, testing the motion alerts. Each time the screen lit up, and each time I felt more certain this little eye would be my witness. I took the envelope from my jacket and taped it to the inside of the door at eye level. I stepped back, looking at it through the lens of the camera. It hung there, plain white yet heavy with meaning. My careful script glared against the blank paper. Rachel and Daniel. It looked almost too gentle for what it carried, and yet I knew it would cut sharper than any blade. I stood in the living room a long while after, letting my eyes wander over the mantel, the furniture, the walls that bore the echoes of our lives. For a moment I almost faltered. I thought of Rachel as a child again, curled up on that couch with her favorite blanket, Margaret reading to her as I built shelves in the garage. But the memory turned sour, replaced by the sound of her laughter that night on the phone, the cold calculation in her voice. The crack in my heart hardened again. This was no longer her home. This was no longer mine. It was the stage for a reckoning. When the light outside dimmed, I locked the door, tested the feed once more on my phone, and walked back to the car. On the screen, the empty hallway stared back at me, silent and still. Tomorrow it would not be empty. Tomorrow the house would bear witness to their shock, their anger, their unraveling. I would not be there in person, but through that hidden eye I would see everything. Driving away, I felt a calm settle over me, heavy but certain. The pieces were in place. The sale, the apartment, the bank, the letter, and now the watchful eye that would capture the truth. For weeks I had been haunted by their voices, their betrayal echoing in my mind. Soon I would replace those echoes with something new, the sight of them realizing they had been outplayed by the man they called a burden. And when that moment came, I would not look away. The alert came to my phone late in the afternoon, just as the sun was slipping low and casting the apartment in a honey-colored glow. The motion sensor lit up the screen, and I opened the feed with a hand that trembled despite myself. There it was, the front of my old house, and Rachel stepping out of Daniel's black SUV. She stretched her arms, her face weary from travel but smiling with the easy confidence of someone returning to what she believes is hers. Daniel climbed out on the other side, pulling 2 suitcases from the trunk, his expression smug, self-assured. They looked like conquerors returning from a successful campaign, completely unaware that the battlefield had already shifted beneath their feet. Rachel fished for her keys as she walked up the steps, her heels clicking against the stone I had laid with my own hands 20 years earlier. I leaned closer to the screen as she slid the key into the new lock. She jiggled it once, twice, confusion flashing across her face. She tried again, harder this time, and the frown deepened. Daniel set the luggage down and joined her, irritation already coloring his movements. I could hear her through the microphone, her voice sharp. "The key isn't working." Daniel took the ring from her, tested the lock himself, then glanced at the garage remote clipped to his visor. He pressed it twice. Nothing happened. His composure cracked. "These are new locks," he muttered, disbelief hardening into anger. "Somebody changed them." The words filled me with a dark satisfaction. I watched him circle to the back door, only to return minutes later, shaking his head. "All of them! Every damn lock!" Oversent what? Rachel pulled out her phone, her fingers frantic, and I knew she was dialing the landline that no longer existed. I listened to the unanswered rings echo in the silence until she dropped her hand, panic creeping into her voice. "He's not answering. It's disconnected." Daniel cursed under his breath, running a hand through his hair. "Try his cell," he snapped, forgetting what she herself had once said, that I never carried one. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. Rachel spotted the envelope taped neatly to the inside of the door. She pushed the window open and reached in awkwardly, tugging it free. She tore it open while Daniel leaned over her shoulder, their faces side by side on my screen. I saw the shift the instant their eyes fell on the words. Confusion gave way to shock, then disbelief, then something darker, a dawning horror that spread across their features like a storm. Rachel's voice rose first, shrill, unsteady. "He sold it. He sold the house. 890,000. Her hand shook as she clutched the letter. Daniel snatched it, reading aloud in a disbelieving growl. "The money is in my account where it will stay. Your belongings are in storage." He crumpled the paper in his fist, his face flushing red. That manipulative old man. He outsmarted us. Rachel began to cry then, the tears streaking her makeup, her voice cracking. This was supposed to be our future. We were going to start over in Boulder. "He's ruined everything." But Daniel was no comfort. His mask of charm and patience slipped away, replaced by contempt. "You should have handled him better. You let this happen." Their voices tangled in accusation, rising and falling in waves of blame. Rachel shouting that he had been the one to call me a burden, Daniel snarling that she had pushed for the sale. The irony was sharp as glass. They were homeless in the very room where they had once plotted to make me homeless. I sat back in my chair, watching them collapse into the furniture I had chosen with Margaret, their shoulders slumped, their faces twisted with anger and despair. For years I had been their support, their safety net, their silent foundation. Now they were left to balance on their own, and they were failing. I turned the volume down, no longer needing to hear the words. The sight was enough. Rachel sobbing into her hands, Daniel staring at the crumpled letter, as though the ink might rearrange itself and save him. They had been so certain of their plan, so sure of my weakness. And now the truth lay before them in my handwriting. I closed the feed and let the silence of my apartment wrap around me. The karma had unfolded as cleanly as I had hoped. They had plotted to strip me of my dignity and my home, and instead they had lost both theirs. Justice does not always come swiftly, but when it does, it has a weight that settles deep into the bones. I lifted Margaret's photo from the nightstand, holding it steady. "They know now," I whispered. "They finally know." When I shut off the feed, the room around me seemed to breathe for the first time in weeks. The weight I had carried since that night on the phone loosened its grip, and for the first time since Margaret's passing, I felt something like freedom. I poured myself a glass of the Bordeaux we had saved for years and never opened, the cork breaking with a sound that reminded me of distant laughter. I raised the glass toward her photo, her smile caught forever in that frozen summer moment, and whispered that I had kept my promise at last. The wine was rich, heavier than I expected, and it tasted like victory tempered by sorrow. I sat back and thought of the road that stretched ahead of me. Not Maple Street, not the driveway where Rachel had once learned to ride her bike, not the kitchen where Margaret hummed at dawn. Those places were gone now, passed on to strangers who would never know the sacrifices hidden in every nail and board. What stretched ahead was something different, something uncertain. For years I had been defined by giving, by building, by being the foundation for others. Now, stripped of that role, I faced an open road where each choice would belong only to me. It frightened me, yes, but it also thrilled me. The apartment was quiet, too quiet sometimes, but there was a kind of relief in that silence. No one demanding, no one expecting. I began to notice small details, the way the light shifted across the wall in the mornings, the faint smell of coffee from the shop across the street. I walked to that shop the next day, sat by the window with a steaming cup, and realized I was surrounded by faces that knew nothing of me. To them, I was simply another man starting fresh, not a burden, not a bank account, not a stepping stone. That anonymity felt like a gift. Still, my heart tugged when I thought of Rachel. A father does not simply erase decades of love, no matter how sharp the betrayal. I replayed her tears in my mind, not with satisfaction this time, but with a dull ache. I wondered if she would learn from this, if the cracks in her ambition might finally let something softer through. Or perhaps she would only grow harder, blaming me for her downfall instead of seeing the truth. I did not know, and maybe I never would. The phone buzzed that evening with a number I did not recognize. I knew in my bones it was her, reaching through another line, searching for a way back in. I let it ring until it stopped. Yet I cannot say I will never answer. Forgiveness is a strange thing. Margaret believed in it, always said it was the only way to live without bitterness eating you alive. Maybe one day I will pick up. Maybe one day I will let Rachel explain or apologize or beg, but not now. Not while the wound is still fresh and the taste of betrayal lingers. For now I need the silence, the space to remember who I am without her voice telling me I am less than I am. At night I dream of roads, long stretches of highway cutting through mountains and fields, the kind of roads Margaret and I once drove just to feel the world open up around us. I wake with the sense that those roads are waiting for me still. I have the means now, the freedom, the time. I could leave Denver entirely, settle somewhere small where no one knows my name, or travel until the ache in my chest finally eases. The thought no longer terrifies me, it steadies me. When I stand at the window of the apartment, I see the city lights shimmer like possibilities. Somewhere out there, Rachel and Daniel sit in a house that no longer belongs to them, their plans scattered, their confidence broken. Somewhere beyond, life moves forward in 1,000 directions, each one a path I could choose. The open road is no longer a metaphor. It is real, stretching ahead, mine to take or leave. I place Margaret's photo on the nightstand each evening, a quiet anchor, and whisper the same words before sleep. I am not a burden. I am my own man. Tomorrow is mine. And each morning when the sun rises, spilling light through the blinds, I believe it a little more. In the end, Thomas discovered that freedom was never about the house or the money. It was about reclaiming his dignity and living on his own terms. Rachel and Daniel learned too late that greed blinds and betrayal carries its own punishment. The open road ahead remains uncertain, but it belongs to him, and that is enough. What would you have done in Thomas's place? Would you choose revenge, forgiveness, or something in between? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more powerful stories like this.